Hi there, Randy Green here, and welcome to a little podcast where I will contemplate, dive into a little bit of the typical question I hear from the majority of the people that are doing the activation and awakening process in whatever forms that they are choosing to do it within whatever teaching system they are choosing to do. But some of these people, they come my way, and one of the typical questions I hear over and again is, why can't I see? I can't see the inner levels of reality. I can't see the other realms. And it becomes a kind of hindrance or unbalancing point in the search for the answers, especially when being surrounded by people like me that kind of have the full spectrum side for good and for ill, because first and foremost, I think it's important that we understand in this work that seeing is a type of perceiving. And when we are seeing things in this physical reality, we are under a very dense type of energy that allows us to see, but not necessarily to feel. And here we're talking about when we talk about feelings and emotions, feelings are electrochemical processes in the body that gets ignited when our physicality, which are a bunch of cells in fields of energy and not really a body as we understand it, when that get in contact with other forms of energy units that are floating around either in a field by that composite form or without what we call a field of manifestation, and then are just what we call energy clusters. We get this imprint from these energies. They interfere with our energy system, and by that we feel an effect in our physical body, aka the three lower fields, with the mental field, the emotional field, and the biofield, constituted of different forms of energy units that interact with whatever is touching, coming in contact with our energy fields, and by that level of information that the energy units hold from whatever form or no form that these energy clusters are within, will then have an impact on the overall energy system that we call the human body and emotions and field. Of course, in our awakening process, we get more and more sensitive. And as that happens, we get more sensitive to the sensations, these different types of energies that are in our surroundings and the impact that they have on us. So we are in the awakening process, when we talk about the higher order senses, are just as much a process of sensitivity. And it is a process of learning to deal with a range of energies that we normally are not in contact with. And this is where the psychotherapeutic angle comes in. And that's why I feel grateful that I took my time to become a licensed psychotherapist, because how would I else explain these things to people that are not into the depth of the psychological processes, and perhaps due to stigmata of societal institutions or different types of paradigms or cultural settings, are not eager to dive into that for reasons and purposes that might or might not be relevant for the process. I know it sounds very, very cryptic here, but it's important that we get the soft levels of multiple layers of information here, and not just me blasting out in short sentences where you will then say, oh, that's what it is. I could, of course, downsize it into base program language, but I would like you to understand the sciences behind this at the same time. So instead of thinking of a body, you think about three fields that are interacting with each other, that are interacting with the human resonance of a reality field that links up to the emotional field, give or take. That's a claim. Science does not support this. It's a claim from me. As well as the ionosphere link up to the mental field, that is also a claim I'm here providing that's not supported by science, because they're not yet on the investigation of these subtle forms of energy. So with that understanding, we also suddenly realize that we are fields within fields within fields within a larger field within a huge composite complex oceans of energies, of which our local energy field is what we say our aura, our eggs to administer. And I talk about this to a deep understanding in the transition science classes, as well as the template science classes, how to go around this, how to administer these fields, what it means, what it is that we need to transform, and the ways that we can transform it. That's my suggestion to it via the principles and rules and the natural laws of energy that goes with the original solar system configuration. But not everybody's into that, and this is where we say, okay, more base program level, please. We have now taken the high level of perception. Step 1, when you perceive yourself as quote-unquote human, try to perceive yourself as fields within fields of energy that interacts with other types of energies that are either in form or outside of form. That would give a broader range of energetic perception. Secondly, when we are in contact with different forms of energies, our physicality via the central nervous system that goes with the brain and the peripheral nervous system that goes with the glands and the feelings or the transmitters that produces the electrochemical processes we perceive as emotions. They are, or feelings, they turn into emotions when we begin to think about what we are sensing in our body via our emotional field. And that comes into a process of what we could say, I feel sad, or I feel this, or that. You hear, I feel this. Then the mental processes have kicked in and are interpreting what we are sensing. So the first important step in the higher order senses, and I do have the whole approach to the higher order senses as a course too, where I explain what are the higher order senses and how do they work and what can we do with them. So I'll put a link below, of course. So for you, if you want to investigate it further in some of the information systems that I'm working within, that will get us through the fourth cycle and into the fifth, where we're now there are so many now getting ready to the future humanities, the new earth, whatever that means, whoever groups are going to go on these timelines. There are 5 different timelines of quote unquote new earth. So it's not just one. That's why it's called 5D, 5 dimensions of new earth. And we are to decide which timelines that we want to be part of. To be able to make that distinction, where do we want to go, we need our high order senses. And that's why men say, I can't see where I'm going. I don't know where I'm not getting any information from within. And that's where we will say, okay, so what are people doing to get this? Step first, we need to change our perception. If we're thinking in physicality and tangible information systems, as if we're reading a book or looking it up on the internet or doing something to receive the information, already there we are kind of within a thought form that is limited within the base program. So we need to start with some new concepts of perceiving. And step 1, everything's energy, and we are in an ocean of energies that are influencing each other in different ways and forms that have a different calibration rate, that creates different oscillations, that creates different types of information systems that are working together or against each other, and gives different types of sensations in the body. That's the first observation object that we are to do in our meditation process, is really contemplate in meditation upon the fact that we're made of energy, and really get the feeling where we slip out of the formative structural layers of the brain and into the non-formative, non-structural layers, where we begin to sense energy as energy and not as thought forms or precognizant ideas of what this or that or whatever that is. So that's the first hindrance in seeing, our own made-up ideas of what it means to see. So that's the first step, where we need to operate within our physicality in a completely different way. The second one that comes in, this is the tangible perception of energy and the tangible ways of changing from formative structural touch, feel sensations that are the physicality of the high order senses, and into the subtle layers of the high order senses, where we understand the first layer that we sense with internally, because it all comes from an inner side, inner hearing, inner sensing, and inner perception of reality, and not an outer tangible touch with our physical organs. But we are now beginning to develop the higher order inner organs that are connected to the brain, that are not eyes and ears and noses and what have you, but are the brain itself that learns to process information from information itself, from energy units itself. And that's a training matter for the brain as well. The brain is built up in different layers. We have the right hemisphere that goes with what we call holistic approach imagery, and processing imagery as a holistic approach, as a full-blown holographic picture. Left hemisphere that goes into the details. I typically say you can't see the forest for the trees. That's the left hemisphere. It also gives the language, which means patterns of information that are seen as symbols or abstract patterns, or something that goes with what we typically will understand as mathematics. Not that it is that way, but it is sequences of information that goes in patterns that are aligned in specific type of configurations that our left hemisphere will interpret it in different ways. And that needs to be expanded into what we call otherworldly perception, that is not necessarily easy to detect, but will go with what, for instance, just light language, which we see without seeing, we sense without sensing, but we know what it means. So knowing is left hemisphere, right hemisphere is literally seeing the different levels of what we're dealing with. And this is, of course, again, my claim, not something science support, important to understand here. These are the otherworldly sciences that base program science is not up to speed with yet. We need to get our visual cortex to play with left and right hemisphere. And to be able to do so, then we need to train our visual cortex. It's at the back of the head. You should look up anatomy here, how the brain is built up. And it needs to activate in the sense that it can go on both modalities of knowing and seeing. At the same time, it also needs to process what we call the internal processes as energy without knowing and seeing, but just as energy that's there, energy that works in this way or that way. That is, of course, a knowing to understand how it works. And we have the limbic system that goes with the emotionality. We have hypothalamus and the hippocampus that goes with memory. Look all of this up, and we've got the frontal lobes where you kind of have what we could say the overview of what is going on. So begin to understand your brain as a kind of not computer, but a computing unit that processes information in a specific way via the different levels of the brain. That's energy too. And then you can, with hands-on healing, people say, I don't know how to heal with my hands. And this is where I don't know how to teach that because I'm born with it. Sorry. So this is just for me. When we don't have it, we need to find a way how to learn with it. But for me, because I've already worked with it in previous lifetimes, it was just something that came natural to me. That's typically why we have it already, because we already done it in previous lifetimes. For those of you who haven't done it, my best suggestion is to go to someone who knows how to teach this. I've been thinking a lot, like, I should do healing courses, but it's difficult for me to teach something that just comes natural to me. So I don't know how it is. I had a barrier, and that's the barrier I want to talk about. That I know, the barrier of these abilities, and that's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of what will come our way, and all of that goes with the emotional field. So we're here in the understanding that the next step is from the perception, the understanding, and the anatomy and how energy works in our three lower fields. We begin with the next field, and that's the emotional field, where we need to clear out what we have of emotional patterns, energy patterns, different forms of configurations that goes with childhood trauma, childhood experiences, and childhood mechanisms from where we have dealt with these different feelings and sensations of energy that were in our childhood environment. This is what we call psychodynamics, and this is the psychological processes of our human being, where we learn to understand ourselves as psychological beings as well, and how does the psyche operate. So these are the sciences of the psyche that we can investigate both as study, but the best one is to go and see a therapist or talk to me as in my capacity as a psychotherapist, added in with my clairvoyant abilities and the different ways I work as a psychic energetic counseling, which is completely different that you would find with a normal psychotherapist. But I do have the complete schooling, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist within what's called existential psychotherapy, where I look at the big questions of why we're here. And I was taught that in group dynamics with other people, where we were practicing the different types of psychodynamics within group settings, as well as understanding how energy influences us. And there was a lot of really good processes in the 4-year education that was necessary for me to become a licensed psychotherapist in Denmark. So with that, just putting that in there. And then later on, I've added my psychic abilities to this, and that's why I call it psychic energetic, because not only is it psychic, but it's also the full sciences behind the energies as part of the whole Academy course material. So in that manner, the way I work is both what we call worldly and otherworldly, and at the same time it has the worldly sciences inbuilt, but it also has the otherworldly sciences. And that's part of the 5th cycle, the sciences. That's the key word here. It's not just about, as we were in the 4th cycle, we just felt something. We just felt the rush of energy. We just felt the bliss. We just felt the grace. That's the emotional field. That's the vibrational field. That's the different type of subtle energy where the peripheral nervous system, instead of just being amplified by the worldly energies, begins to get amplified by the otherworldly and the energies of the other worlds and the other realms. And these energies, to begin with, does feel pleasant. And with that, we are tapping into some of the layers of the astral plane. And that's where the brain needs to kick in to discern, is this actually something I want to float around in, or is this just a little bit of astral bath that I have got that is not really in our best interest in the manner that we are understanding what it means to fully awake. A lot gets stuck on the astral plane, and all of these bliss feelings and grace feelings and the different types of entities that floats around that are remains of primarily Pleiadian genetics and other what we would call more benevolent beings that used to be part of our reality field but are no longer part here. And if we really dive into what these clusters of energies are and how they present themselves in different forms of astral overlay, we will see a sadness that is within these beings because they're stuck and they cannot go anywhere. And the only way that they can make themselves known is actually to operate through a human. So they are in a way slightly possessive. Okay, so that's another story, and they are tied to nature, and these are typically what we call fairies and devas and angelic beings and all of these avian, Pleiadian, it sounds nice, type of configurations that got, for reasons and purposes, brought here originally, used to be in form, but later on lost their ability to be in form and now stuck in the different distortion fields of our planet. So that's where we begin to understand that when we do this work, after the rush of the kindness that we encounter with these beings, there is also sadness that is the layer, the valley of tears, as is said in the esoterics. You go through different valleys. These are different layers of your awakening process. And that's the existential sadness that when you really tap into nature and when you really tap into reality as it is, there is a humongous amount of sadness. And that's an existential sadness. It is a collective existential sadness, and it's a collective existential grieving over the loss of what was and what's no longer there. Let me just put it that way. So some of the parts of when we talk about why can't I see, if we are in our own psychodynamics that are tied to our childhood and our upbringing and how we have come to be a grown-up being, have decided not to see certain aspect of our childhood trauma, or have decided not to see, a sense or feel some of the dynamics that were in our childhood home, we have shut down the ability to sense energy. We have shut down the ability to see and process energy and see things as they truly are. mostly because some of the things we saw as children we didn't understand, so it's easy just to shut it down because it was overwhelming and fear-provoking. So we turned away from it, we shut it down, we suppressed it, we put it out in our emotional field somewhere where we didn't feel it. But just because we're not looking at it and we're not processing it, or we put it out there, doesn't mean it goes away. It just means we have parked it somewhere in our emotional field where we won't feel it, and then we build a wall between that and us. But it's a fragment. And that fragment, as we have seen it with many other things that are roaming around in the subconscious as well as on the astral plane, all of these are fragments of things that people have not been willing to look into and transform and deal with. They have segregated themselves from it, pushed it away, and said, I don't want to feel this, I don't want to see this, I don't want to be part of this. And made that coding that in your field, emotional field, everything that's unpleasant, I don't want to feel it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to deal with it. And if I then tell you that seeing on the other realms, it's just as complex as it is within this realm. Some of it is pleasant, a lot of it is not pleasant. And if you have made that deliberate choice at some point in your life or a previous lifetime, I don't want to see, I don't want to feel, I don't want to know what it is. Well, of course you can't see. Of course you're limited now to not see what's going on in this reality as it is now, including the other realms. So that's the first step, the first blockage of not being able to see is, of course, within our own emotionality. It is within who and what we are and who and what we have chose to become part of and sense and feel and see. So that unlocking of that decision is, of course, part of the first process. And that goes with the psychological work, as well as the inner sight, the contemplation, the meditation, and going into some therapeutic processes where we'll learn to feel the spectrum of energies that emotional technically are, and we'll learn to have what we call conducive thought forms to these different forms of emotions that comes up instead of the more infantile ones we produced as a kid. I don't want to do that. We go in and look at it and say, okay, what is it? We investigate it, we run through the process, we learn to be in it, because what we didn't have as children when we were younger, we didn't have the frontal lobes. We didn't have that reparenting ability to look at our inner child, look at what we were before, look at what is going on and take a step back and say, you can do this. Be your own best parent. Learn to take care of yourself in the way that you should have been taken care of. But since most adults are children themselves, we can of course go in the whole kind of blaming our parents for being this and that, whatever. There's a huge truth to that, but we must also think about the time and the culture and what was culturally acceptable at the time of our parents and onward and so forth. And we can then decide to do better with our children, of course. But aside, that's a whole other type of information that needs to go there. But all of these are part of what we could say the reparenting processes, where we go in and say, okay, as a child, as this being that I am, what did I really need? And then because we are now the grown-up ourselves, we can reparent our inner child and teach the inner child in different visualization techniques, in different forms of inner work techniques, and in different types of visual run-throughs, reparent ourselves to create a new type of pattern where we empty out the old pattern, replace it with a more conducive interpretation of the original pattern. Because when we had that the initial trauma, we created certain thought forms around it. Some of them might be accurate, some of them might not be so accurate. And we go in, that's what therapy technically is, we go in and look at these thought forms and these interpretations and say, this is in alignment with what actually happened. This is not in alignment, and what is not in alignment, we can then get it in alignment and then get a different understanding of it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes you feel better. It just means that now you understand it from a grown-up perspective and not stuck, froze in with the interpretation of a child, but has now brought it into awareness as a human being, and by that can develop a different, more broad-spectrum type of coping mechanism to whatever it was. But some of the things that we have experienced are just so unpleasant that even though we do look into them and we do reparent and we do create new conducive understandings of what it is and interpret it in its full scale, and by that really sense what it is, sometimes it just needs to be sensed and felt and cried out and go into the processes of the sadness and the sorrow and the pain that's there. And also be okay with, okay, I understand what it is, but I'm also feeling the pain of what it is. And I will then learn how to soothe and nurture myself in that pain that I feel so I can get balance. So my body learns that pain is unpleasant, but it's not going to have a huge ramification as the sky will not fall. And these different layers that are also part of what we call a more conducive way of dealing with our emotions. So we are saying here that the first step that we need to learn when we do the activation and awakening process is to learn to have more conducive way of observing the way we think, and in that way choose patterns that are balancing more than creating distortion or creating things that makes things feel worse, because what we think will affect how we feel. So if we, and it's not about becoming indifferent and say, I don't want to feel anything, I don't care anything. That's not what it is. That's just a 5-year-old that's just overloaded and say, I don't care. But that I do that sometimes when I'm overloaded. But when I then get back into my frontal lobe and take the more mature stand, I'll go in and say, okay, what needs to be transformed? What is there? Which box does it belong to? How do I deal with this? And once if it pops up again, how do I then deal with it in a more conducive way so that the emotional outburst and the way that my body respond to it will be more in balance with what actually is going on, and what would be, what we could say, a version of where I can express how I feel. I can express my anger or my discontent or whatever it is, but in a manner so that it gets the point of the meaning across, but without creating a huge havoc of energetic overflow for whatever that means. So that's what I mean with a conducive emotional pattern or understanding, where we learn to navigate in our emotions, but take away all of the subconscious layers that has a tendency to influence. If we have an old issue that opens up, the first time it opens up, because there's so much bottled up, will typically be very, very unbalanced, and it will be a huge release. And with that understanding, I can release this. Of course, it's unpleasant for everybody that experiences, and that's the repair we'll have to do afterwards, including the repair on our own central nervous system and peripheral nervous system and emotional field. But once the energy is offloaded the pattern, then we can begin to look at it and begin to transform what can be transformed, and what cannot be transformed will be left like a kind of what we call an emotional scar. But that's just a scar. It's no longer loaded with energy. It no longer blows up in our face. It's just there as an old scar or something that was, and we know it's there, and we can think about it, but it doesn't affect us to the same degree anymore because we have offloaded it emotionally. When we talk about the work on timelines and how our heart responds to what we will see there, that's where that process, the ability to process information and energy as energy, and vibrations as vibration, oscillations as oscillations, and how they affect our physicality becomes enormously important. And that's the observer, and that's the mental field that we need to develop into being able to cope with what it is that we will come in contact with. Because when we work with the energies and the other realms of our reality field, we will see it with our mind's eye, as it said. And that means that we will perceive and sense and feel everything we come in contact with. Of course, depending on how far out in our field it is. If it's in the 5th, 6th, and 7th dimension, we will most likely just observe it via our mental capacities. These will begin to come to life as we work through the scientific understandings of what it means to be energy within energy within energy, as we learn through the emotional, psychological processes of dealing with what we're seeing and sensing and feeling, and learning to be in it and learn to transform it, and the sciences that are behind the whole transformational aspects of what we call psychic energy, which I talk about in the transition sciences as well, where I talk about the psychic psyche is energy, the psyche is processes, and how to keep the psychic energetic balance. And then I go into the more advanced understanding of the emotional field and how it's built up of rings and different layers that we can clean our way through. And then we begin to understand, okay, I kind of see why my brain is not now really just working with all of these different layers of energy. It's not just a matter of seeing. It's about clearing out what is in the way, as well as transforming energy so that our brain begins to process otherworldly energy units, and by that can link up to the other worlds and begin to perceive on the other realms and begin to perceive in the other dimensions. And if the human brain is focused entirely in the bodily processes and the undeveloped emotional field, well, then you have cut off your right hemisphere, and you have cut out the abilities for the inner organs, the higher order energy organs, to process information, because there is nothing they can process. So of course you can't see. There is, of course, much, much more to this. But this is just the beginning point of when people ask, why can't I see? Because you have not initiated the process that will get you at some point to be able to see. And the first step is to see things as energy. The second step is to acknowledge the different emotional patterns and learn to be in these different types of energies that we are feeling and sensing via our emotional field, the vibration and the information systems, and as well as training our brain to process the higher order types of energies. And once that's established, begin to develop the inner organs that allows us to sense in the other realms. So again, I can only recommend doing the transition sciences as well as the higher order senses course that I have put out there. I have some course material for free. I'll put links below that you can begin. One of them is Whole Integration Class 6, where I talk about how to actually build the center in the middle of the head that allows us to begin to operate and integrate different types of higher order energies. So and that goes with some of the old esoteric material. That's why it's out there for free. But if you want the more fifth cycle approach, how to complete the fourth cycle and work through so you get the organs that are needed in the fifth cycle, well, then it's the transition and template sciences, where I explain these different levels that must be worked with for us to get our full capacity back and to process and navigate in the other realms of our reality. And with that little complex scientific approach to the ability to see sense in the higher order realms, thank you for listening in, and until next time, take care.